Okay. Well, good evening. We are so thrilled to be here. Gosh, in the last 10 years, we've been at many of the events that you've sponsored, so thank you for inviting us back for this very special night. In front of you is the St. Mary's College Glee Club, and we have Tucson. St. Mary's College Glee Club. And we also, yes, exactly. So we went to South Africa over a year ago when we went on one of our choir tours, and we had the incredible experience of really touring the area and getting to know people and visit lots of historical places. We also had the very impactful experience of going to Soweto. And I think we're all changed by that, and we are so thrilled that one of our pieces is from South Africa. So we're going to close with that, and I'll tell you a little more about that piece in a moment. Our first piece, though, we only have two for you tonight. The first one is called Shambhala. And some of you more close to my age might know that tune because it was a Three Dog Night tune. Yeah. And it's Shambhala is sort of has roots in a lot of mystical spiritual teaching, but it's meant to be our truest, greatest self, experiencing a sense of enlightenment that we are our very best. And the song talks about people who are on the path to be their very best see the very best in everyone. So it's really about that beautiful path to be better. So this is Shambhala.
Wash away my trouble, wash away my pain in the rain of Shambhala. Wash away my sorrow, wash away my shame in the rain of Shambhala.
Shambhala, ooh, yeah, 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 yeah. Ooh, yeah, yeah, Shambhala. Everyone is lucky, everyone is kind on the road to Shambhala. Everyone is happy, everyone is so kind on the road to Shambhala. Ooh, yeah, 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 yeah. Ooh, yeah, 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 Shambhala. How does your light shine in the halls of Shambhala? Oh, how does your light shine in the halls of Shambhala? Ooh, yeah, 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 yeah. Ooh, yeah, 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 Shambhala. Ooh, yeah, 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 yeah. Ooh, yeah, 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 Shambhala.
So as previewed, our last piece is CILSA, which is sort of become the anthem for South Africa. And roughly translated, it's the train is leaving, get on the train, meaning you don't run away from the struggle, you go into it, and you keep on going and you keep on fighting. So we give you CILSA.
CILSA, yabaleka, when you yabaleka, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. When you yabaleka, when you yabaleka, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. Shosholosa, shosholosa, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. Shosholosa, shosholosa, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. Africa, kule bom, bom, 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 kule bom, South Africa, bom, kule bom, kule bom, kule shosholosa, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. Shosholosa, ekule zontaba, simela sikumesa. South Africa.
Good evening.
The mission is centered around the head, the heart, and the hand. It requires us to think, it requires us to feel, and of course it requires us to do something.
CILSA's big audacious goal when it was founded was to create a culture of service and social justice through faculty collaborations, community collaborations, and student leadership that would permeate the entire campus community. It's present now in the core curriculum. Students are taking community engagement courses in multiple disciplines, from the sciences, business, liberal arts. Some of CILSA's early pioneers include someone like Shawnee Anderson and her work, particularly through January term travel courses, doing direct service work, helping people who are largely in the midst of traumatic experiences.
It's possible to say that community engagement isn't something we should foist upon every student, because when students get into these community situations, they might hesitate and be reluctant, but after a series of experiences in the community, they find their perspective changing. They really do find themselves seeing the world in different ways. And so I think community engagement almost always leads to really positive outcomes for everybody.
Our students come to St. Mary's in part because they know that this notion of social justice or equity, and then also cultivating student leadership, is part of who we are. We have the Jumpstart program, the public service internship, Monument Corps for middle school success, and the Micah Summer Fellowship, where we have students living in community, working in nonprofits.
I'm so appreciative of just the opportunities that I've had to learn more about social justice issues that I care about, but also just restructure and reframe that idea of what family looks like in my own life.
It's pushed me in so many ways and has taught me that patience can lead to a lot of great things.
I think plants have really taught me that everything takes time and you don't really notice the smaller changes until you're already something completely new.
When we started out with CILSA and Micah, we didn't have a farm. We didn't have Plowshare's Nursery. We didn't have a community garden as big as we have now. And so, in having a large group of motivated volunteers lets you take on those projects and build that capacity. Whereas if it was just our own staff doing it, it would take years to do what they can do at a couple of volunteer events. Beyond that, though, by working with St. Mary students and CILSA, for our residents, it's really about people caring about them. It has an impact.
I don't think I would be where I am today in higher education as a success coach if I didn't go through that program. Now I work with students one-on-one and coaching them through whatever goals they set for themselves, whether it be academic, social, personal, professional. Students are our future.
There we go. Now it's on. Good evening. My name is Jennifer Pigza, the director of CILSA, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you to CILSA's 20th anniversary celebration and this theology and religious studies speaker. Before we continue, I would like to have another round of applause for the choir. I think they've probably already exited, but tonight I feel my gratitude for CILSA and for St. Mary's and for the living witness of the Catholic Lasallian traditions very deep in my bones. And I think that starting with music feels right. So I appreciate their presence here. As you know, tonight we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action, known as CILSA. We celebrate the practice of deeply engaging our heads, our hearts, and our hands towards social justice, inclusion, and sustainability. I'm going to frame my opening remarks around these three. And for those of you who need a little bit of a sense of where are we headed, I will let you know this. So I will talk for a little bit. Then the provost will talk for a little bit. Alejandra, we have an alumni speaker. And then the provost, the president, and then Leo Guardado, our special speaker tonight. I pledge that we will be done so that those of you who would like to attend 8 o'clock Mass have enough time for a little bit of breathing in between. And for those of you who just need to get home and to other things, you will be able to do that about 7:30, 7:45. So just a little forward casting for those who need it. So I'm going to frame my remarks in the opening here around the head, the heart, and the hands. For the head, the people who gave birth to CILSA envisioned a campus department dedicated to community engagement in the Catholic Lasallian tradition. In collaboration with the brothers, in their mind's eye, they could see a campus transformed by students and faculty in partnership with communities. People like then President Brother Craig Franz, then Provost Sally Stamp, and faculty like Shawnee Anderson, Michael Barham, and Patrizia Longo, some of you who have them in class, were part of that early dream team. They inherently knew that student learning is deeper when combined with direct experience and action in communities. Today, the programs and initiatives of CILSA foster intellectual development, content knowledge, and our capacities for social justice. I would like to invite any faculty, staff, brother, or administrator who has collaborated with CILSA over the years to please stand and be recognized. I think there are more of you than standing. Thank you. Thank you. Together, we are CILSA. The heart. At the heart of CILSA's work has always been a love for students and a commitment to partner with nonprofits, schools, and communities. These two loves for schools and communities are the touchstone for our decisions. The heart of CILSA invites us to consider how our emotions are as engaged as our minds. How being engaged with service provides new insights about who we are and who we are called to be in the world, both individually and as a collective, as a college. I would like to thank our student leaders, like those 20 alumni that we honored tonight and whose reflections you saw in the slideshow before we started. I would also like to honor our community partners like Alameda Point Collaborative, with whom we have a 15-year plus relationship. At this time, I would like any alumni in the room, including our 20 alumni awardees, to stand and be recognized. Alumni. CILSA is better, and St. Mary's is better because of you. Thank you. And finally, the hands. In the end, the work of CILSA is practical. We engage the world in order to build new knowledge, to test what we think we know, and to explore who we can be. Through our hands, we learn about social justice and injustice. Sometimes our hands get dirty. Sometimes they form a fist in defiance, and sometimes they fold in prayer. Each year, 25% of undergraduate students take a community engagement course, and 75 students participate in CILSA's leadership and social justice programs. Please stand if you have ever taken a community engagement course or been part of one of CILSA's programs. I know y'all are out there. Thank you. St. Mary's is better, and the world is a little better because of you. As we all know, the work of CILSA, the work of the head, the heart, and the hands is not so easily separated. It's an integrated system of mutually reinforcing processes. And so tonight, I've invited an alum to share her reflections on just that. Alejandra Pinto Garcia, class of 19, was a Jumpstart Corps member, a MICA Summer Fellow, a public service intern. She studied in Rwanda with CILSA staff during a January term. Alejandra now is an AmeriCorps Vista member as part of St. Mary's Project in collaboration with Stanford University. And as a Vista member, Alejandra serves in an organization that supports day laborers. Ryan, one of our staff, said that Alejandra's leadership is characterized by her capacity to listen and feel deeply. She seeks truth, goodness, and beauty wherever she goes. The world needs to watch out for Alejandra. And here she is, so let's watch her now.
Thank you, Jennifer, and the entire CILSA family for inviting me here tonight. Si caminas con tu corazón, tu cuerpo lo seguirá. If you walk with your heart, your body will follow. In the summer before my senior year, I was a MICA Fellow in Tijuana, Mexico. As a MICA Fellow, I served at Fundación Gaia, an organization that recently opened a job recruitment agency for deported migrants. During our reflection at the end of the 8-week experience, we took a walk at the boardwalk of Playas de Tijuana. There, we experienced the art installation 20 Corazones de Pie, a project whose goal was for artists to send messages of love and unity. The boardwalk was filled with 20 heart-shaped sculptures, each painted by a different artist. One particular blue heart stood out to me. The inscription read, "Si caminas con tu corazón, tu cuerpo lo seguirá. If you walk with your heart, your body will follow." Through CILSA, I learned to listen to where my heart is leading me. CILSA has been central to my time at St. Mary's College. Navigating college as a first-generation student, I felt lost my freshman year and struggled to find my place. However, during my sophomore year, I began getting involved with CILSA, and the rest is history. CILSA became one of my homes away from home at St. Mary's. It challenged me and encouraged me to find my voice and provided a space to build community with others. I will forever hold that in my heart. If you walk with your heart, your body will follow. In January of my senior year, I traveled to Rwanda. I walked with my heart, and my body followed. That trip changed my life. I learned that 3 simple words can have huge meaning: kumva, kwiga, and gukunda. To listen, learn, and love. In order to learn, we must listen. And once we listen, we also learn to love. Sharing our stories and listening to others helps us create community. If I can do that in Rwanda, I can certainly do it here. Through CILSA, I learned how to use my head to acknowledge that I have a lot of learning and unlearning to do. I've learned how to follow my heart, to listen to who I am called to be. And I've learned how to use my hands. I've learned that the time to act is now. I am especially grateful to have found others who share a common purpose. Si caminas con tu corazón, tu cuerpo lo seguirá. If you walk with your heart, your body will follow. The inspiration of CILSA carries me forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Margaret Cosmatos, and I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at St. Mary's. It's an honor to be here tonight to celebrate CILSA and all the people who contribute to the success of community engagement at St. Mary's. In 1999, faculty, administrators, and leaders at St. Mary's and the San Francisco district of the Christian Brothers came together to give birth to CILSA, a department charged with growing a culture of service and social justice education at St. Mary's College. It was the first of its kind in a Lasallian institution. It was an experiment, a highly successful one. Under CILSA's first director, Janet Luce, CILSA built a network of faculty and students who were interested in how the college might more fully embody Catholic social teaching and the Lasallian tradition of education as a practice of liberation. Under Marshall Welch's leadership, community engagement became more professionalized, faculty development more intentional, and the college became more connected to national conversations about service learning and community-based research. And now, with Jennifer Pigza at the helm, CILSA is deepening its practice of place-based justice by strengthening relationships with community partners and examining how racism and other forms of oppression impact our work, both internally and externally. CILSA is both a catalyst and a partner. CILSA has been a key player in several campus initiatives. The Social Justice Coordinating Committee, which is now part of the College Committee on Inclusive Excellence. Multiple grant projects with faculty development, which resulted in new community engagement courses and the redesign of the Justice, Community, and Leadership major. The establishment of community engagement as a component of the undergraduate curriculum. When I was first learning about St. Mary's College, I was immediately drawn to and impressed by the work of CILSA. I particularly appreciate the work of faculty who are dedicated to incorporating community engagement into their teaching and scholarship. It's not always easy. I am deeply committed to higher education as a public good and admire how CILSA has helped St. Mary's make that purpose come to life. And I'm inspired by CILSA's efforts to integrate the learning that happens in the head, the heart, and the hands. In fact, St. John Baptist de La Salle used the word miracle to describe this kind of transformational work with students. So tonight, I'd like to express my appreciation for the miracles that CILSA has been performing for the last 20 years. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the president of St. Mary's College, James A. Donahue, who will welcome and introduce you to the speaker, Dr. Leo Guardado.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be here, an honor to have all of you here, and for me to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful celebration of CILSA and everything that it has been and everything that it continues to be. Both as the president of St. Mary's College and as a theologian, I am pleased to be part of this celebration of CILSA and to have the distinct honor of introducing our distinguished scholar. First, as president, tonight we honor 20 outstanding alumni who have shaped CILSA and who continue to embody what it means to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. Their quotes that you have seen in the slideshow remind me of the value of our Catholic, our Lasallian, our liberal arts education. These traditions weave together seamlessly in the work of CILSA. My first-hand experience with CILSA have been connected to the Micah Summer Fellowship and the college's partnership with the Alameda Point Collaborative. Each summer, my wife, Jane, who actually is a volunteer at the Alameda Point Collaborative ever since we arrived here 7 years ago, every summer, Jane and I host a dinner with the Micah Summer Fellows, like Alejandra. Each year, I am impressed with the Micah Fellows' curiosity, humility, and desire to build more just and inclusive communities. I am impressed with the intentionality that CILSA builds into the classroom. I am grateful for how students connect their Micah experience to their growing sense of purpose and meaning and academic learning. As we celebrate CILSA's 20th anniversary, we must also acknowledge our community partners. The Micah Summer Fellows live and work at the Alameda Point Collaborative, a housing community of formerly homeless families. Through CILSA's efforts, APC has been a partner with St. Mary's for more than 15 years. Through Micah, through community engagement courses and research. In just a single visit to Alameda Point Collaborative, you can see the impact of St. Mary's, an organic garden, research-based responses to food insecurity, teen mentoring, and enhanced job training programs. As president of St. Mary's College, I love seeing how what we are doing at the Alameda Point Collaborative and in all of our work makes a positive difference in people's lives, in our students, and in our communities where we serve. The second reason I am excited to celebrate tonight has to do with my identity as a theologian, and specifically as a theologian who is concerned about the public role and value of theology. Alejandra's inspiration, if you walk with your heart, your body will follow, provides a beautiful link to our keynote address by Leo Guardado, St. Mary's College, class of 2004, and assistant professor of theology at Fordham University. Professor Leo grew up in rural El Salvador before fleeing to Los Angeles when he was 9. He was formed by Lasallian education, both at Cathedral High School and at St. Mary's College, where he was an early CILSA student leader. He served as a Lasallian volunteer in Brooklyn, New York, pursued a monastic life in a Trappist monastery in Northern California. Yes, he's done that. He's shaking his head. And worked in Tucson, Arizona, addressing the needs of migrants. Dr. Guardado's ongoing research focuses on human displacement and its challenge to the church. The church's response to transnational violence that displaces persons from Latin America to the United States, and his research in the practice of church sanctuary. He is informed by liberation theology. We shared stories earlier. I happen to have the privilege of living with Gustavo Gutierrez, the great liberation theologian, for a summer in Boston at Boston College. He is informed by liberation theology, the lived experience of Latinx communities, and Gandhian nonviolence. He is interested in continuing to reconcile the socially transformative wisdom of these traditions. Methodologically, he engages with ethnographic approaches with the craft of theology. And this is extremely important merger of methodologies. And to see how ethnographic approaches can help serve as a means of accompanying communities while also generating scholarship. Tonight, in honor of CILSA's 20th anniversary, we have asked Leo to reflect on Micah 6:8 in a contemporary context. Specifically, Leo will explore this question: what does it mean to do justice, to love mercy, and act humbly, given the signs of the times and the state of our world? Leo, we are honored that you were here, and I welcome you back home. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Great, thank you. It's good to be back. And I feel like the prodigal son who returns home to a feast but which shows and reveals the graciousness and gratuitous love of the home he left. So just thank you for welcoming me back. Origen of Alexandria, the 2nd and 3rd century theologian, chewed on Scripture and generated mystical insights that still illuminate our understanding of divine love. He speaks of Scripture as different types of food that nourishes people on their journey. Some scriptures, he says, are like meat. They are tough, but provide sustenance for those more experienced souls. Some scriptures are like milk, best given to those early on their journey. The only reason why I allude to Origen's insights in Scripture is because it is my understanding that the iconic verses from Micah have provided ongoing nourishment for CILSA as generations of students have chewed on what it means to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Perhaps these verses have been a little milk for some, introducing them to the richness and complexity of Scripture's relevance to a life focused on eradicating injustice. For others, perhaps these verses have served as a tough challenge to an understanding of faith that has not yet made one the love of what is most divine with the love of what is most human. Like CILSA students, my task is also to chew on these verses, and as with all Scripture, to read them not only in their own context, which I will do, a practice I learned from one of my Scripture professors here, Michael Barham, but also to read them in light of the joys, hopes, griefs, and anxieties of our people, especially the most forgotten. In the minutes I have with you, I will weave Micah's call for justice and mercy with the pernicious reality of violence, human displacement, and ongoing forms of colonial existence. And I want to suggest that our capacity to resist these forces of death lie in our capacity to walk with the mystery of God, to go where God goes. Our call is to follow, even if it means persecution and death. In following this holy mystery, we are always looking at God's back, never having full clarity of where we are going. But as Gregory of Nyssa, the 4th century theologian, reminds us in his analysis of the life of Moses, good does not look good in the face, but follows it. And thus you never want to see God's face, because it means you're going in the opposite direction. To walk humbly with God is to always follow behind, to let the one who is justice and mercy itself lead us beyond ourselves. This is an exceedingly difficult task that requires agonizing discernment and the surrender of our very selves. But it is, as we will see, what Micah wants us to remember. Micah's iconic verses have a long intertwined history with U.S. politics and this country's identity. In 1921, President Harding used George Washington's Bible and kissed these verses during his inaugural address and presidential ceremony. In 1977, Jimmy Carter was also sworn in as president with the Bible open to these verses. And if we go back further into the history of this country, we find Micah's verses as a cornerstone of John Winthrop's famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity. His sermon, delivered in 1630 as he and a shipload of Puritan immigrants were making their way from England to the lands they would come to forcibly possess in New England, was meant to provide moral guidelines for establishing a city upon a hill. Winthrop writes that the only way to avoid shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Micah's verses are at the heart of Winthrop's text, a text that scholars consider as foundational for the pervasive notion of American exceptionalism that still undergirds our country's identity. Perhaps Micah rolls over in his grave every time these verses are kissed at the altars of politics. For as a prophet, it was his divinely ordained job to speak on behalf of God to the kings and powerful people of his time, who also thought themselves exceptional. Like Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Micah was a reality check in his times, shining light on the festering wound and putrid structures of a society that had become an instrument of death for the powerless. Let us recall that Micah lived in a time of great political division and instability in the 8th and 7th century BCE. On the international scene, in 722, the Assyrian Empire had made of its people permanent deportees. In the south, the land of Judah, with its capital city of Jerusalem, would continue as a dominated region under threat of a similar fate. Nonetheless, in the middle of these international pressures, Judah was undergoing an economic transformation, leading to the creation of vast estates, where the wealthy who possessed land could thrive, while the small peasant farmers would become the possession of those in power. Thus Micah calls out those, quote, who covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away, those who oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. While the gap between the rich and the poor grew wider, priests and so-called prophets also made of their ministry a business. Micah writes that Jerusalem's priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. Truth had been commodified, and the word of God had become a financial transaction. With raw words, Micah paints the fatal effects of this political and religious corruption when he proclaims, "Listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people, the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people. Flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron." The social, political, and religious moment in which Micah lived meant death to the poor and insignificant, for they were consumed by those who had the means and power to do so. As a native of the countryside near Bethlehem, Micah knew that his peasant people were mere fodder for Judah's economy and for those who benefited from its machinations. Micah's context is a piercing reminder of my own context growing up in El Salvador in the 1980s. For literally, torture was used to tear the skin off my peasant people, break their bones in pieces, and dismember them like meat for a cauldron. It is no surprise that at the chapel of the UCA, the Jesuit University in San Salvador, the Stations of the Cross are of mutilated flesh, devoured by the violence of a system created for and supported by those who coveted more land for wealth and who seized it, destroying anyone who dared speak truth to power. Later this month, on November 16th, we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the brutal pillaging of the lives of the Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter, who lived in the University of San Salvador, and whose truth refused commodification. It is no accident that when they were murdered in 1989, the heads of the Jesuits were crushed with the butts of rifles until their brains were smashed. For symbolically, the government had to eliminate the critical thinking, the social analysis, and the theological insights that they saw as the source of their truth. A good education is a great threat to power. Similarly, this December 7th, we commemorate the beatification of Brother James Miller, FSC, whose work to teach and protect the indigenous poor of Huehuetenango, Guatemala, also marked him for elimination. To this list, we can add the 4 church women, Ida Ford, Dorothy Casel, Jean Donovan, Maura Clark, whom we remember on December 2nd, and the witness of Rutilio Grande, Oscar Romero, and countless women, men, and children murdered by a powerful transnational system that still seeks to protect the life of the privileged at the expense of the most vulnerable. A system that in Micah's words, abhors justice and perverts all equity. These our departed friends who walked humbly following God were echoes of the holy, for their lives spoke of the God of life. The great Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel writes that prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, the voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. Like the prophets of old, these our friends prophesied a dangerous truth, that the cry of blood and bones is the cry of God. Or in the words of Bartolomé de las Casas, a fierce defender of the indigenous communities of the Americas during the European colonization in the 1600s, who said, God has a very fresh and living memory of the smallest and most forgotten. Those who walked humbly with God, following even unto death, remind us that God's living memory and the forgotten of this world are one. To forget one is to forget the other. This too is the content of Micah's prophetic words, for they are a reminder to the people of Judah that they have forgotten their God. Through social, political, and religious corruption, and the death that causes, the people have broken their covenant, the relationship that binds them one to the other and to God. Thus Micah not only excoriates them, but prophesies a trial, a courtroom where God brings God's own people to judgment. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice, God says to Israel. The mountains, the foundations of the earth, and all of creation are a witness to God's accusations and to the people's betrayal of each other and of God. In Micah's text, God demands an answer. O my people, what have I done to you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. God's work of liberation, of recreation, of salvation in bringing the Israelites from death of oppression unto freedom stands as its own verification that God has been faithful to the covenant, that God does not deceive or forget. How can an accused people provide a defense before the one who has a very fresh and living memory of the smallest and most forgotten, a people who they once were? There is no legitimate defense other than a humble surrender to the truth of their crime, to the less than exceptional behavior, to the reality that few may be guilty, but all are responsible. And thus in Micah's text, we hear in the voice of a single person who is representative of the whole of the people, the existential struggle of how to remember a relationship that has been torn apart. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Each of these possibilities for remembering the relationship is a peace offering, but none is the offering of the people's very selves. Can God's favor be bought with sacrificial transactions? Can a people's deepest call, their very vocation as a people vis-a-vis God, be satisfied with providing animal or agricultural goods, regardless of how valuable or numerous these may be? According to Micah, there is but one way for healing the wound between the human and the divine. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? This is the heart of the covenant, the dangerous truth of the prophets. These are the sacramental and healing rituals of authentic worship. It would be ideal to stop here and let these verses serve as a climax of Micah's lesson for his people and for us. But the reality is that right after these iconic verses, after the people seem to have recognized their crime, guilt, and responsibility, God unleashes God's fresh and living memory of the forgotten. God says to God's people, "Can I forget the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked? Can I tolerate wicked scales and a bag of dishonest weights? Your wealthy are full of violence. Your inhabitants speak lies with tongues of deceit in their mouths." God's indictment continues, and prophecies of punishment pour like rivers of oil. For the rest of the book of Micah, the possibility of the total corruption of a people, as well as the hope of a radical conversion, intertwine. In the very last verses, God's fidelity and mercy and God's promises to God's people are emphasized. For after all, God does not forget. It is us who fail to remember. To do justice is to remember God. As we face the global reality of mass human displacement that only seems to increase year after year, how can we even begin to speak of justice? And first, let us distinguish between justice and laws or legality. For while laws can aid or hinder the pursuit of justice, justice in the biblical sense always exceeds any historical processes aimed at addressing the multiple wounds and death of a people. To attempt to do justice in relation to the over 70 million people forcibly displaced worldwide would require the impossible task of addressing the intricate web of abused and severed relations that have generated the conditions for these displacements. For us in the U.S., the question of justice for the hundreds of thousands of people that keep showing up at the southern border every year necessitates addressing the colonial history and ongoing neo-colonial existence of a people south of the border and within our cities and fertile valleys, who are but consumable and disposable goods for the capitalism that is the beating heart of this country. While no one person or community is capable of doing justice in any definitive way, because God's memory of the forgotten always exceeds our capacity to remember, it certainly does not mean that we cannot participate or cooperate with God in the struggle against injustice, regardless of how feeble or humble our efforts may be. Sometimes justice in relation to displaced persons begins by welcoming them to our colleges and universities, regardless of legal status or ability to pay. When my mother and I left El Salvador in 1991 because of the US-funded war that was still raging and children like myself were still being conscripted to fight, I did not realize that by crossing rivers and borders, we would no longer simply be Salvadorans, but would become illegals, wetbacks, and a host of other terms. For a young person, these labels have a way of naturalizing, of eroding self-worth, and of generating shame. When I started at St. Mary's in the year 2000, I was still undocumented and could not receive federal aid or work study. My mother earned $9,600 a year cleaning houses, so there was no way for us to pay for college. However, I needed to work if I was going to remain at St. Mary's. CILSA was a few months old at the time, and through the creative initiative of the brothers, I ended up working in this new Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action. I profoundly remember the first time I stepped foot into the CILSA office, what is commonly called the fishbowl. It's the only thing there was for CILSA at that time. Janet Luce and Sarah Niedhofer welcomed me, and I found an experience of home and work that would sustain me for the years to come. And so to Lucy and to Sarah, if she's here, muchísimas gracias. I suspect the various rules and regulations were broken in order to make room for me and other students like myself who do not easily fit in within the legal parameters of our institutions, which privilege those who have over those who have not. Very few people in college knew that I was illegal, and I had no desire to share this information with others. It's already difficult for a poor person of color to fit in our historically white institutions, and the added layer of illegality did not help. Most societal structures, including those of colleges and universities, communicate in ways imperceptible to those born here that one does not belong. Those persons who go out of their way to explicitly communicate through their actions that we do belong are in their own humble way doing justice. I was a sophomore when I finally had my chance to go before a federal immigration judge to plead my case. But the courtroom was in Los Angeles, and I had no car, could not drive, and I could not fly. Brother Michael Meister graciously drove through the night so that I could make my morning appointment with the judge and return in time for class. After all, I was here to get a good education. So, Brother Michael, mil gracias. Friends, beginning to address the macro injustice of US-funded wars throughout the world that destroy the past of persons means that we have a profound responsibility to make room for their future. We are called to do justice even if it leads to the breaking or changing of norms, rules, and regulations. After all, it is these laws that in their own way continue to keep those at the margins. But let me press further with what is at stake in attempting to do justice in relation to human displacement. This November 12th, Scott Warren, a 36-year-old university professor of geography who lives in southern Arizona and who works with a humanitarian organization called No More Deaths, will face a second trial for his efforts to save unauthorized lives. He was charged by the U.S. government with harboring, aiding, and abetting immigrants. But the jury this past June could not come to a decision of whether he was guilty of these so-called crimes. What did he do, you may ask? Well, he was arrested by Border Patrol in January 2018, along with Jose Arnaldo Zacaria Goday, age 21, from Honduras, and Cristian Gerardo Perez Villanueva, age 23, from El Salvador, both of whom had found respite in a No More Deaths barn after being lost in the desert without food or water. The barn is a shack of sorts that serves as a stopping point for volunteers heading into the wilderness to place gallons of water. Warren found them in the barn and allowed them to eat food, drink water, and rest. The very practices of hospitality we find in the Torah. Border Patrol does surveillance on humanitarian organizations throughout the border. And they observed Warren with these two young Latinos. The three of them were arrested on the same day that No More Deaths released a report documenting the systematic destruction of the gallons of water that No More Deaths volunteers place in the desert. The report estimates that between 2012 and 2015, over 3,500 gallons of water were destroyed, mostly by Border Patrol. Warren's humanitarian actions were a means of walking with God and resisting the dehumanizing forces that literally seek the corporal death of these non-persons whose irregular existence is problematic for the legal and political conceptions upon which this nation and much of Western modernity depend. While we could interpret these events at the border simply as the carrying out of law, such a reading does not get to the heart of a modernity that relegates whole peoples to new forms of colonial violence. Sociologist and legal scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who for years has researched and written on the epistemological frameworks of Western modernity that uphold and perpetuate capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and the intersection of all of these, invites us to become aware of what he calls the abyssal line, the abyss that separates us from them. In Western modernity, he writes, there is no humanity without subhumanities. And at the root of the epistemological difference, there is an ontological difference, he says. Thus, what is allowed to exist, to be true or real, depends on what is allowed to be seen, to be made visible and recognizable in our epistemological horizons. For persons who survived on the other side of the abyssal line, mechanisms such as international human rights and the rule of law become no more than deceptive mirages, constantly beyond their ability to access. To reread the current events at the borderlands through the abyssal line is to recognize that the physical border, the so-called wall, is the material manifestation of the invisible distinction demarcating those seen as human and those human objects that can only be engaged through multiple forms of violence. From the perspective of colonial power, the two immigrants who were also arrested the same day as Scott Warren are not so much within the realm of what is illegal as much as in the realm of that which is lawless, beyond the law. That which is paradoxically and simultaneously produced as non-existent. These people do not exist and yet in need of elimination. At the root of Warren's prosecution and persecution by the U.S. government is not so much that he may have crossed a line between legality and illegality through his humanitarian ministry, and he calls it a ministry, a faith-based ministry, but rather that his actions make visible the abyssal line that can only exist by being invisible and denied. For the illusion that we all live on this side of democracy in a non-colonial reality is essential for this country's ongoing belief in American exceptionalism. Friends, beginning to do justice entails learning to see the unauthorized other as human, but not only that, but as the bearer of knowledge, whose truth of being is a challenge to the rationality upon which our modern Western systems, including colleges and universities, are built. Fundamentally, to begin to do justice, we must first learn to see the world, literally and figuratively, from the other side of the line, from the perspective of systemic and unjust human suffering. Learning how to see otherwise, decolonizing our ways of knowing, the production of knowledge itself and the aims that this knowledge serves, who benefits from this knowledge, requires that we walk with God to where God is already preferentially present, which is on the other side of the line. But none of this happens without that most fundamental of human and thus divine qualities, love. But not just any kind of love, but the love of mercy. Etymologically speaking, mercy, misericordia, means putting our heart on the poor, on the miseros of this world. One of the theologians who has written most insightfully on mercy, especially in light of radical suffering, modern-day crucifixions, and colonialism still marking Latin America, is John Sobrino, one of the Jesuits that would have been killed by the US-funded Salvadoran military in 1989 if he had not been traveling. Sobrino is unambiguously clear that when speaking of mercy, he's not referring simply to a sentiment, a feeling, or to individual works of mercy. Rather, he's speaking of a principle, of a structuring reality of love that goes to the very root of all reality. He writes that, quote, mercy is a fundamental attitude toward the suffering of another, whereby one reacts to eradicate that suffering for the sole reason that it exists, and with the conviction that in this reaction to the ought not be of another's suffering, one's own being hangs in the balance. As a reaction to another's suffering that has been interiorized within oneself, this enfleshed love generates the condition for authentic being, for the very possibility of being human. Thus, the suffering of the other implicates not only an ethical question, what I or we to do, but an ontological one. Who am I? Who are we? And to be fully human, Sobrino argues, is to react with the love of mercy to another's suffering in order to eradicate it. Mercy stands at the origin and at the end of a truly human and thus divine life. It is the minimum and the maximum principle, the first and the last, and that which joins the struggle to do justice with the humble knowledge that we must walk with God who leads us and who is already sacramentally present in the suffering other. If mercy is the criterion for authentic humanity, then an authentic church, and by this I don't mean a building, but rather we the people who claim ourselves followers of the incarnate God, must have mercy as our foundation. In a world of mercilessness, or what Sobrino calls anti-mercy, a church that merely practices individual one-time works of mercy or preaches nice words about mercy will be tolerated. But a church that is structurally reconfigured by the principle of mercy will face systemic violence by all that opposes mercy. To be transfigured by mercy is for the church and all of our associated faith-based institutions, including colleges and universities, to be decentered by the wounded ones. For us as a church to think ourselves from outside ourselves, from the streets and the borders where the victims of an inhuman history lie. On a global scale, the most deadly wound of humanity is poverty, an evil that kills people before their time. The words attributed to Mahatma Gandhi still ring true, that poverty is the worst form of violence. A church that reacts to this violence and all its related forms in order to eradicate it will be, as Sobrino says, quote, threatened, assaulted, and persecuted. Contrariwise, the absence of such threats, assaults, and persecutions demonstrates that while the church may have managed to perform works of mercy, it has not allowed itself to be governed by the principle of mercy. Walking humbly with God, following in the footsteps of the incarnate one, inevitably entails a willingness to suffer. To put it simply, the church too, if we are the community of faith we claim to be, must risk bearing the marks of a wounded and crucified flesh. At the very least, this mark of mercy will make us, the church, and our institutions credible. By way of conclusion, let me say that since his election as Pope, Francis has made mercy the central category of his papacy. One of Francis's most profound statements is that God's justice is God's mercy. A stunningly beautiful and pithy way of communicating a forgotten truth about the relationship between these two pillars of our identity. May our doing justice be our borderless mercy, made historically concrete as we learn to walk with God across the lines that divide us, as we learn to love as God loves, and as we learn to reflect the divine nature that is our human end. This is what Micah does not want us to forget. And this is what the Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action has helped generations of students remember. So congratulations on 20 years of bearing witness to what is good and what is required of us in this world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo. We have some time for comments, conversation, questions with Leo. Anyone? Yes, this is not working. So.
That this being the border, theology, theology, great. Being undocumented in high school at Cathedral, it was home. It was 95% Latino. I mean, I was at home in many ways. I fought a lot with God as a junior and senior. I cussed God out every night. And I said, how dare you displace me from El Salvador, where I lived and enjoyed the forests and the rivers, to come to LA and to not be able to work and to not be able to go to college? Like, who do you think you are? You're God, okay. But whatever. How dare you? Like, is this of God? You know? And I took that seriously. And I think it was that kind of, perhaps as Minnesotans say, chutzpah, generated a relationship. A relationship that gave birth to questions. We inherit traditions, various kinds. So I inherited religion. I inherited a religion in El Salvador that was being killed by military forces, Romero, the sisters, etc. That wasn't happening in LA necessarily, but the questions of my own history and my own struggles with God led to, I guess, the study of theology, and I had the great privilege of taking beautiful courses. I remember Brother Michael Avila's life stories in theology, reading Gandhi for the first time, reading Vatican II documents in his Vatican II class, the Bible with Michael Barham. So, and the list goes on of great professors. I always regret not taking Meister Stante class. It haunts me to this day. But that's what brought me to theology, is the questions of my own existence, my people's suffering, and that is why I do theology. Religion is a great source of power, and it will be used and abused by those in power. And unless we know our traditions and are able to resist its abuse, not only abuse in politics, but its abuse within the church itself, then we are always at the service of those who have knowledge. So as I said, knowledge is a good education is a great threat to power. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah. There was a... I don't find religion a very interesting thing, but I find God a fascinating one. And I always distinguish for my students between faith and the struggle to make sense out of one's own identity, and religion. So let's see, last week I taught queer theology. Before that, I taught black theology. Before that, feminist theology. Before that, liberation theology. Now we're moving into theology on nonviolence, theology on colonialism. This is a first-year student class, so I'm having them read key thinkers that have problematized their tradition, but they're working out of their inherited, the good and the bad, or the good and the less good, or the good and what's been used to abuse and suppress people. And what continues to do so within the church, as you point out. And I always want to distinguish for my students, or let me rephrase this, I want them to say, or to think of the possibility that even if you can't reconcile yourself to organized religion right now, of whatever variety or form, that may not necessarily mean that you cannot reconcile with this mystery that may be a possibility for them. And that certainly I think is much more of a life-giving possibility given where they are. I want to say, like, the tradition also bears riches and richness for them. But it's a struggle of holding the two in tension. Tradition gives us life. It passes on the past. But it's our responsibility not to pass on the same that we inherited to the future generations. It's our task to rework it, rethink it, to make it better, to make it less violent. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Could you expand that out a little bit beyond education and theology? What about if I'm not studying theology, but if I'm just here in college, how does that connect to the questions of epistemology, particularly ontology, right? Where the system is dehumanizing. What is education for, I guess, is broad.
Yeah. So part of the skills that I try to emphasize in my classes is how to be, maybe things that you probably learn in other traditions or in other disciplines, how to be critical readers of text. I mean, if you learn how to critically read scripture, how the process that gave to its generation, the editing, who was at the table when it was being produced. As Elizabeth Johnson says, the symbol functions. It does something. The Word of God does something in terms of how it's used or abused. I emphasize, at least in the classroom for my students, the craft of theology, teaches you how to also deconstruct the world and the social construction of the worlds that we inhabit. I said when we just did queer theory and theology, I said to the students, I just start by giving them a little example. I mean, how many of you are left-handed? You know, like a few. Well, you know, do you know what left is in Italian? I said, oh, sinistra. What does that word sound like? Oh, sinister. Oh, do you realize that at one point, left-handed people were deviants of the norm, of what was normal, and that which deviates from the norm has to be sanctioned, controlled, violence is imposed upon it. So I helped them, and as we start thinking of where does the transgender community, for example, fit within our churches? Where do people who are labeled as deviant in one way or another? I start with, I guess, trying to make these connections for them. To study theology is not to become theologians for most of them. I said it's to learn how to think critically and how to reconcile. I said your own sense of self as a beloved person, whether you believe or not, that don't let the negative aspects of the tradition that do not reflect God tear you down. Our task, I think, as theologians, at least for myself, most of my students are nuns, I guess I call them, is to make them aware that they are beloved. I don't know, I'll stop there. I don't know if there's any more questions. Yeah. The monastery. Sure. How? Why? Excellent question. Right. So this monastery makes wine. I love wine. It is located in Vina, California. It's about 2.5 hours door to door from here. Actually, we're just reminiscing that about 5 of us, our senior year, we went up there. I took them up there, and we had prayer with the monks and met the abbot, and it was this wonderful experience. Where does monastic life fit within me? Monastic life is perhaps one of these deviant things within the church. Always at the margin. Historically, they would take in criminals. They would protect people fleeing from the law. They were these places of refuge. And they've always kind of been at the margins of the church. They're quirky enough, odd enough. I mean, who in the world wants to get up at 3 a.m. and go to bed at 8 p.m. and just be a farmer and pray 7 times a day? This was the order that I was with, Trappists. Why? Why would I ever do that? I'm an only child, single parent. Who's going to care for mom? These were all very real questions for me. It makes absolutely no sense. Other than what I started with, when you wrestle with the mystery, and it takes you down this rabbit hole that never seems to have an end. And for me, it was seeking the depths of that, of the silence, of the prayer, of the wilderness. In a monastery, you're alone most of the time. You have a lot of time to think, to meditate, to pray, to be in the woods. And despite the fact that they make wine, we couldn't drink it. So as I learned, guests that are in the audience would bring me a few contrabands. It was my wrestling with the mystery. So maybe it's no accident that I teach Christian mystical texts at Fordham, among other things. I teach Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and Bernard of Clairvaux and Catherine of Siena, all these quote-unquote crazy mystics that have these visions. But see, the mystical tradition has always been a subversive tradition, a source of power for women who had no authority. Hildegard of Bingen, the first woman to be allowed to preach. Why? Because she had visions and wrote them down. So Bernard of Clairvaux helped her with the church to give her the freedom to go and preach, as a woman, as an abbess. So it's been a source of alternate power in history, and I think in one sense it still is. But not only in terms of power, but the spirituality is one where if you're there because the whole of you, your body, your mind, it's a surrendering to this mystery. And as I said earlier, it's this agonizing discernment process of who am I? Who am I really? And not just who I present myself to be to the world, but the person that I really am. And Thomas Merton, who's in this order, his notion of holiness is to be you. He says to find your true self. To be holy is to be you. To take off the masks that we put on. So holiness is not something that you find out there. It's a process of letting the masks go and letting the true self be. There is no way of getting to God unless you go deep, deep, deep into yourself. The path is not outward, it's inward. And it's in that inward that generates then the outward commitment, even to death, to the poor, etc. So I couldn't reconcile the two. I couldn't be a monk and do my passion for questions of injustice, given my own personal history, so I had to make the choice. I applied to grad school when I was in the monastery, and I had to make a quick decision. Do I stay or do I go? And I said, I don't want to live a life of regrets, and I'm going to... and the regrets is that if I left for this interview for the doctoral program, I couldn't go back to the monastery, was the condition. So I wasn't yet accepted, but I said, I don't want to live a life of regrets, so I'm going to go, even if I don't get accepted and can't come back. And so I went, I got accepted, thank God, and went through that program, and so, yeah. So I carry the monastery within me. We are. Sure, thanks.
Before we say goodnight, just one more round of gratitude. Thank you, Leo, again.